A weathered old cemetery cursed by the infamous Salem Witch Trials. A forested inn whose bounds harbor the ghostly memories of love and loss. And a military fort where a terrifying lady in black lurks after dark. Are you ready to explore some of the most haunted places in Massachusetts? Our first haunt takes us just north of Boston and on a tour of the iconic Burying Point Cemetery. The old Burying Point Cemetery, which is placed smack dab in the heart of Salem, Massachusetts, is a weathered graveyard boasting the title of being amongst the oldest graveyards in the state. That's bounds are exceedingly popular amongst sightseers, tourists, history buffs, and, more recently, with paranormal investigators, for the absolutely astounding range of purported supernatural phenomena reported on site. Historically, as settlements formed across the U.S. through the early 1600s, a sleepy fishing village called Nomkeog had formed on lands that would one day hold Salem. And as maritime trade increased, this settlement would grow quickly, namely due to its particularly deep natural harbor, which allowed for much larger vessels and more of them, as well as for its proximity to various coves, rivers, and important water features. By the 1630s, Salem had evolved into a regional center for trade, fishing, and coastal travel. And as the need for various civic institutions arose, Burying Point Cemetery would form sometime around this era, with documentation suggesting it was formally established well after its earlier graves, in or around 1637. Over the years, Burying Point would become the city's principal burying ground, and in 1673, one Dorothy Cromwell, wife of Philip Cromwell, was laid to rest. Now, I only note this burial in particular simply because Mrs. Cromwell's grave now holds the title of being the oldest still standing grave within the yard. In 1692, Burying Point, like the rest of the town, was cast under the shadow of the Salem Witch Trials. And during this time, the yard was actually the center of several disputes when families of those accused and executed weren't allowed to lay their dead to rest on family plots within. Additionally, it's worth noting that while they didn't die during the trials, the graves of both of the witch trial magistrates John Hawthorne and Bartholomew Gedney, who, together, were responsible for their part in the executions of so many innocent people, also lay within Burying Point. Burying Point would continue to act as an active graveyard through the 1700s and up into the 1800s, before finally it would be considered full and would cease accepting new interments. Through the eras, the yard would go through seasons of disrepair and then renewal, until finally, in 1975, it was honored on the National Register of Historic Places, after which it would welcome a series of repairs and preservation efforts, and has grown to become considered one of Salem's most iconic landmarks ever since. In the present, Burying Point remains open to the public from dawn until dusk, and alongside a number of historic tours that take visitors through the cemetery, several local paranormal touring options also get those who are feeling especially brave much closer to the old property after dark. Over its very, very lengthy existence, this weathered old yard has acted as scene to a number of purported paranormal phenomena, and those who have ventured within have reported strange fogs that descend upon the property alone and on otherwise clear days, disembodied voices heard from empty spaces, especially at night, and sightings of shadowy figures that slink around after dark, that stick to the shadows and avoid the light. What is probably the most famous spirit sighted within the yard is that of Mary Bright Corey, the second wife of Giles Corey, who was a victim of the witch trials. Giles, a profitable farmer, was accused by a neighbor of witchcraft, an accusation which in reality was likely just a beef gone way overboard, probably due to Giles's outspoken nature. And instead of submitting to a corrupt court system, Giles remained silent as they slowly pressed him to death by laying large stones on his chest. Corey actually remained silent until near the end, but just as the courts believed that he was about to break, he instead yelled out, "More weight!" a cry that echoes into eternity and stands for no less than freedom from oppression. Corey was eventually pressed to death and, being labeled a witch, was buried in an unmarked grave. Conversely, upon Mary's passing, she was laid to rest within Burying Point. From the time of her passing and onward, many have claimed to have sighted Mary's spirit clad in a beautiful white dress. Her youth returned to her in death, and her figure nearly glowing, and most tell of her making her way along the gate of the yard and stopping at the northern end, and staring off towards where Giles is supposedly buried. And some nights, although much more rarely, a figure believed to be that of Giles has been known to appear on the other side of the fence, interlocking his fingers with Mary's for moments before they both just vanish. Also reported at Burying Point are encounters with the spirits of both of the aforementioned magistrates involved in the trials, being John Hawthorne and Bartholomew Gedney, who had a hand in no less than 20 executions, and who it would appear are reaping exactly what they sowed in the afterlife, as run-ins with this duo usually paint them as scared, and often as being suddenly surrounded by a group of shadowy figures that envelop them, before seemingly pulling them back down, clawing and kicking, to whatever hell their own personal otherworldly jury sentenced them to. Traveling just south down the coast into Boston, our second haunt takes us on a tour of the Old State House. The Old State House, or the Old Provincial State House, which is located where else but in the heart of Boston, Massachusetts, is a former seat of government and politics turned educational venue and museum that's bound to attract all manner of history classes, tourists, sightseers, and more, and that boasts a pretty infamous assortment of ghostly happenings and inexplicable activity. Historically, following the 1630 establishment of Boston under Puritan colonists, the community would meet in either taverns or, for important votes, various civic buildings that were only available during certain times. And in 1658, what was called the townhouse was constructed to serve as a center of government and politics. Unfortunately, this original townhouse would burn to the ground through the Boston Fire of 1711, and from 1712 to 1713, a brand spanking new state house was constructed in its stead. For years, this state house would serve dutifully. In 1748, the construct would be heavily damaged in a fire but would be quickly repaired. In 1770, it would bear witness to the nearby Boston Massacre, and through the ensuing Revolutionary War, when it was occupied by the British, it was used as a military barracks. Sadly, Boston's State House would incur considerable damages during this time. However, following the war, the entire neighborhood would undergo repairs and refurbishments, and the State House was no exception and would be returned to its former glory. Following the Revolution, the State House would continue to act as a seat of government until 1798, when the new Massachusetts State House was brought into being, and after which, the old State House would serve a variety of purposes, most notably acting as a departure point for horse-drawn carriages that were heading to outlying towns. The interior of the State House would host a series of businesses, one of which, being William Barry's hat store, would operate for over 22 years until its closure in 1829. And after the property was cleared of small businesses, starting in 1830, the site would act as Boston City Hall for just over a decade, during which time, in 1832, the site would again be heavily damaged in a fire and would be quickly repaired. From 1841 to 1881, the old State House would be utilized as commercial space and would host a new set of businesses, alongside some heavy alterations. In 1881, the Bostonian Society was formed under a dedication to preserve the site, and beginning around the same time, the structure would welcome an extensive set of repairs and renovations that would return it to its original design while also pursuing intended designs that were actually never followed through. In 1904, the State Street MBTA station would take up occupancy within the old State House, and is actually still there today. In 1907, the site would welcome another massive restoration. From 1909 up into the 1940s, the Boston Marine Museum would occupy rooms borrowed from the Bostonian Society, and in 1960, the whole of the expanse was designated a National Historic Landmark, and just 6 years later, it was also added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1976, Queen Elizabeth II herself and Prince Philip would tour the property during their visit to Boston, and the Queen would even issue an address from its balcony. And more recently, in 2020, the Bostonian Society would merge with the Old South Association in Boston to form an entirely new collaboration called Revolutionary Spaces, which continues to operate the museum still. In the present, the old State House remains open as a museum most days from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And while touring options of the site are available, several local ghost tours also pass by the building and delve into further histories and lore that sometimes aren't covered in your average day tours. Now, while no particular deaths tied to violence or strong emotion were ever documented within the State House, and while it's not exactly known what lies at the heart of the site's hauntings, over its many years, a large number of reports of ghostly activity have surfaced from within, and include doors that open and close on their own, the smells of tobacco smoke, cologne, and perfume without source, and the near constant feeling of being watched or followed by someone or something unseen. Paranormal investigations of the structure have yielded high EMF levels, EVPs captured in audio and video recordings, and hits on spirit boxes. And a range of full-bodied apparitions have been observed, many donning clothing from colonial times spanning all the way up into more modern attire. Notably, a more commonly encountered spirit is that of a tall man dressed in a colonial-era suit with a serious look on his face, and this agitated soul has been sighted pacing around or quickly striding through different areas of the State House in a stalwartly determined manner. Lastly, easily the most significant haunting tied to the State House didn't actually take place within, but just outside, where, in 1770, amidst the American Revolution, 9 British soldiers shot a handful of people in a crowd that were protesting against them, resulting in 3 immediate fatalities, and the injuring of 8 others, 2 of whom also died from their wounds. This event would go on to be recognized as the Boston Massacre. Now, some nights right around 9 o'clock, which was when the massacre transpired, those near have told of sudden bright yellow-orange lights that flare up outside of windows in that direction, as if supplied by countless lanterns or torches on street level that simply aren't there. And this light is usually quickly followed by a series of musket shots and screams, and then by darkness and silence. Moving into the heart of the state, our third haunt takes us west from Boston and has us investigating the Higgins Armory Museum. The Higgins Armory Museum, which is located in Worcester, Massachusetts, is a massive 42,000 square foot structure recognized for its housing of 24 full suits of historic armor, alongside thousands of additional artifacts and educational materials for years, that's now popular amongst history enthusiasts, class field trips, and tourists alike. And its bounds are thought to harbor a number of restless spirits tied to those who lived and died inside the very real, very historic collection of medieval defensive gear that it once boasted. Historically, this peculiar museum's legacy starts through the early 1900s with one John Woodman Higgins, who was a prominent industrialist and entrepreneur in the area, and who also owned the Worcester Pressed Steel Company. Now, when John wasn't running the company, he was a bit of a free spirit, and he traveled to lands far and wide. And when by chance he found himself in Europe through the 1920s, he was absolutely fascinated by its medieval history and began collecting a wide array of arms, armor, and steel artifacts. In 1927, he would purchase 8 full suits of armor to add to his collection from one George J. Gould, and by this time, his house, which he'd been using to store all of his artifacts, was feeling a bit cramped. Incidentally, in 1928, Higgins would incorporate his prized collection as a museum, after which, in 1929, he would start construction on a looming steel and glass museum building right next to his factory. Subsequently, what was called the Museum of Steel and Glass would open its doors on January 12th of 1931 to a grand gala that featured society's elite and performances by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Oh, and an appearance by Higgins' son, who was clad in, you guessed it, a full suit of authentic armor. This museum's design would promote a variety of displays involving weaponry, armor, artifacts, and also automobile parts, and even an all-steel airplane that hung from the ceiling. Ultimately, this educational venue was a very smart move, entrepreneurially speaking, of course, as Higgins would run tours that started with his impressive armor collection and that would move through the ages and end in a show in his modern steel production line. Specially built catwalks that ran high across the room were open to visitors who roamed overhead while observing full-scale steel production, and Higgins was so enthusiastic about his company that he'd encourage his employees to visit and hang out on their breaks, or even during their time off, and they often did, in order to find inspiration in their own lives. Sadly, Higgins would pass on in 1961 and would leave a $17,000 endowment to the museum. With the museum open to the public, its board raced to allocate funding for ongoing operation, and over the years, through various events, fundraisers, and more, the museum was able to allocate funds necessary to remain in constant operation. More recently, in 1980, the site would be added to the National Register of Historic Places, and while several renovations have taken place on museum grounds, nothing has been altered, and this impressive construct that looks like something out of a fantasy movie appears today very much how it did when Higgins laid eyes on it for the first time so many years ago. In the present, while a bulk of the museum's collection has been moved to the Worcester Art Museum, the Higgins Armory remains a historic landmark and noteworthy site visited by countless travelers from all walks of life, each and every year. Now, quite simply put, the whole of the Higgins Armory Museum is believed to be haunted by a ridiculous number of spirits, tied to the artifacts that spent so many years there, and activity within is so intense that it's warranted the museum contacting a number of occult or religious specialists, and has even resulted in the site being featured on the popular paranormal investigation TV show, Ghost Hunters. Both staff and visitors to the museum have reported disembodied footsteps heard across its vacant floors when no one else is around, odd snippets of muffled conversations that some swear are in different languages, and ominous black shadows that have been both captured in photos and videos and also observed by the naked eye. Some have told odd tales in which they've entered the building to find it packed with rows of suits of armor, and have looked around in astonishment for moments before everything fades in the blink of an eye, while others have whispered of more terrifying instances in which these suits of armor begin to move by themselves, dismount their stands, and approach as if preparing for battle. Also recorded across the property are strange clanging noises, old-timey music without source, and the uncomfortable feeling of being tapped or touched by unseen hands. And paranormal investigations held on site have yielded strange temperature fluctuations, odd reactions from dogs, and unexpected readings on laser grids. While no one has reported feeling threatened by the ghosts at the museum, some experiences are far less than pleasant. On several occasions, witnesses have told of hearing the phantom sounds of battles long lost to time, ferocious yells, the sharp clash of swords, and the clatter of countless feet, while others have described grotesque scenes in which they've stumbled upon dead bodies clad in armor and bearing horrific wounds. Lastly, the Higgins Armory Museum's most famous ghost is none other than that of old John Higgins himself, who's been known to appear so solid as he greets visitors that they think him an actual living staff member, before turning for a split second to find he's disappeared. Our fourth haunt is just a short drive northeast of our last, and lies tucked away as the cozy and surprisingly haunted Longfellow's Wayside Inn. Longfellow's Wayside Inn, or more simply just the Wayside Inn, which is placed out of Sudbury, Massachusetts, is a historic lodging that boasts the title of being literally the oldest operating inn in the country. Its bounds are extremely popular for weddings, events, and amongst sightseers from all walks of life, and that carries with it a somewhat infamous reputation for strong paranormal activity experienced within. Historically, and this is literally from what we can tell, because this place actually predates accurate documentation, the inn's archive holds papers that date back to as early as 1686, though it could have existed much earlier, and they also contain an official inn license that was granted to David Howe in 1716. Howe would run the establishment as a family business, and eventually the inn would be taken over by his son Ezekiel, who would go on to fight with the Sudbury Minutemen through the American Revolution. Notably, during its earlier years, it's documented that 2 enslaved individuals also lived at the inn, being an unnamed girl and a man that everyone called Portsmouth. Through different eras, the Wayside would remain in the hands of the Howe family all the way up until 1861, when 5th generation Howe, Lyman, passed on unmarried and without children. Over the following year, the inn was transformed into what was called the Red Horse Tavern, and during this time, it would be visited by famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who described the site as a rambling, tumble-down building 200 years old, until now in the family of the Howes. Longfellow would go on to write a compilation of poems titled Tales of a Wayside Inn, while staying right on site, and he would release his work in 1863. In 1893, the tavern was purchased by Howe family member Herbert Howe along with Homer Rogers, and notably, Rogers was actually the first non-Howe to have a hand in the business. Herbert, however, had no intention in keeping the inn, and together, the duo would meticulously renovate the entirety of the property before, in 1897, selling it to one Edward R. Lemon, who converted it back into use as an inn. More recently, in 1923, the last owner of the inn was actually auto tycoon Henry Ford himself, who visited a few times and fell in love with the site, and who'd started planning to develop it into a historically oriented village museum. Unfortunately, Ford never accomplished his goals, but he did establish a non-profit aimed at the inn's preservation, one which still operates the site to this day, along with its museum, watermill, and archives. Ford would also go on to establish a boys' school that operated on site from 1928 to 1947, under the motto, "The only way to learn is by doing." When all was said and done, Ford reported that he'd spent no less than $1,616,956.11 on the project. And while he cherished it, ultimately, he would accomplish his dream museum in the form of Greenfield Village out of Dearborn, Michigan, and in 1945 would sell the Wayside. Sadly, a decade later, in 1955, the inn was gutted by a large fire, and along with most of its interior, the blaze would also claim irreplaceable antique collections provided by Ford. Repairs were swift, however, and during the process, the inn was actually returned to its exact state during the time Longfellow stayed there. Following a $500,000 grant from the Ford Foundation, in 1958, the inn was reopened and has remained as such ever since. In the present, Longfellow's Wayside Inn remains open to this day, marking it, as mentioned earlier, as the longest operating inn in the whole of the country, and it offers accommodations, tours, and hosts all manner of events each and every year. Now, not really all that surprisingly when considering how long this place has actually been standing. The whole of the Wayside is rumored to harbor a number of ghosts tied to its lengthy past, and both staff and guests to its bounds report strange creaks and groans from empty spaces, as if someone unseen is standing there. Instances of light switches seen flipping on or off by themselves, and shadowy figures sighted rounding corners into rooms that, when checked later, are completely vacant. While stories involving the ghosts at Longfellow's vary widely, with some claiming they've seen the spirit of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow himself, and others swearing that the site was built on some sort of native burial ground or something. Ultimately, these claims have gone unfounded. The most famous ghost that's been cited again and again within the old lodging has to do with the aforementioned Lyman, who was, if you'll remember, the Howe who died with no one to pass the inn on to. You see, Lyman had a sister named Jerusha, who it said truly loved their old family business. And when Lyman began over-drinking, Jerusha actually stepped in and, in an era when women weren't allowed to own their own businesses, ran their family business fearlessly. She began pulling in new guests, always had the place immaculate, and would entertain the entire property by playing the piano, which, might I add, was actually the first piano in Sudbury. At the time, Jerusha was actually recognized as the Belle of Sudbury, and though she had many suitors, she brushed them off one by one without a second thought. That is, until a charming Englishman swept her off of her feet. The two fell quickly in love, and before long, this man asked for Jerusha's hand in marriage, to which she accepted. Before their marriage, however, the man decided to travel back to England to meet with his family and tell them of the news, and Jerusha waited and waited, but unfortunately, the man never returned. And while some versions of the story say that he simply got cold feet, the most popular versions tell that he was actually lost at sea. Whatever the case, Jerusha never met anyone else she took a fancy to, and she would die alone at 44. To date, the piano on site has a habit of playing on its own and often to the tune of Copenhagen Waltz, which was one of Jerusha's favorites. And her fully manifested spirit has also been cited numerous times, namely in rooms 9 and sometimes in 4, where she likes to appear in the middle of the night and cuddle her lonesome form up against male guests. Saving our spookiest haunt for last, our fifth and final destination takes us on a tour of Boston Harbor and has us exploring the weathered and prestigious Fort Warren. Fort Warren, which is placed on George's Island in Boston Harbor, is a sweeping historic military defensive structure that's stood guard over the seascape since the early 19th century. That's bounds are now a popular destination for both tourists and history buffs, and its weathered old walls are tied to some of the state's most terrifying ghost stories. Historically, as part of ever-expanding coastal defenses, a fort was considered on George's Island for quite some time, and in 1833, construction of Fort Warren was started under the Army Corps of Engineers, with the project headed by one Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, who set to work on the designing of a pentagonal base that sheer size would claim the title of being the 5th largest of the 42 other third system forts around, and that would boast room for 200 guns. Construction of Fort Warren took just under 30 years, and the project was officially completed in 1861, just in time for the American Civil War. As the North fought the South in an epic battle for human rights, Confederate forces never actually reached Boston. However, the fort stood guard nonetheless, and its large capacity would see it utilized to hold prisoners of war instead. During this era, from 61 to 64, the fort was held under the command of Union Colonel Justin Dimmick, and while this certainly wasn't the story in other POW camps at the time, Dimmick was actually known for his compassion, mercy, and humane treatment of his prisoners during the war. Of over 1,000 or so detained there, only 13 died, most from pre-existing injuries or illness, which actually marked it as the Civil War fort with the lowest documented mortality rate. As a funny and slightly heartwarming bit of trivia, when Dimmick's son, also Justin Dimmick, left for the front lines of battle, he would actually receive correspondence of endearment from his prisoners, if he should be caught, that their fellow Confederate soldiers were urged to treat him and his men well. Through August of 1863, 6 prisoners would participate in an escape attempt. However, 2 were caught while still on the island, 2 were caught sailing toward Canada, and it's suspected that the remaining 2 likely drowned. Notably, one of the Union's most famous marching songs, John Brown's Body, was written at the fort and utilized the tune of an old Methodist camp song. And when famous author and poet Julia Ward Howe heard this song, she was encouraged to write the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which would actually be paired with the same melody, and now stands as one of the most iconic musical pieces of the era. Following the Civil War, Fort Warren would see numerous upgrades over the years as it was renovated to stay relevant for an ever-evolving battlefield. And from 1892 to 1903, it was modified to accommodate modern, breech-loading rifled guns under the Endicott program, which would also see some of the defense's older gun positions swapped out for more modern batteries. Following the turn of the 20th century, Fort Warren would stand as a silent sentinel to the harbor. Around World War I, the fort would donate 4 of its 10-inch guns to be used as railway artillery on the Western Front, and in 1919, these missing gun stations were outfitted with M1888 guns instead. The coastal bastion would see service once more during World War II, when it served as a control center for Boston Harbor's South Minefield, which was set as a precaution in case of potential attacks by German U-boats. And it would be occupied by the 241st Coastal Artillery Regiment, a state-assigned National Guard unit that underwent special training and was federalized in 1940. Following this war, Fort Warren would remain under the control of the federal government, but it was scarcely used. In 1958, the state would acquire the site and would set to work on a series of restorations. And in 1961, Warren was opened up to the public as a historical and museum site. After which, in 1970, it was both designated as a National Historic Landmark and also added to the National Register of Historic Places. Following its status upgrade, the fort would undergo various maintenance and preservation projects over the years. It remains open into the present and is accessible by way of ferry or by private watercraft. While Fort Warren was one of the gentlest forts of the era, nevertheless, the site is absolutely saturated in ghost stories and local lore, and those who have visited its bounds have experienced activity not dissimilar to other more battle-forged Civil War locations, including phantom bootsteps heard seemingly marching through the courtyard, ghostly gunshots and cannon fire that are believed to be echoes of training courses carried out over a century prior, and encounters with a host of soldiers in uniforms from various eras that manifest so solidly that most who encounter them figure they're reenactors, only to be told later that no reenactments are taking place at that particular time. Paranormal investigations of the island have yielded exceedingly high EMF levels, hits on spirit boxes, and orbs captured in photography and video, and sometimes very real illuminations not dissimilar to these orbs are observed over the waters nearby at night. Referred to as corpse lights or a form of will-o-wisps. Per legend, these devious glows have been known to appear to vessels lost at night, in storms, or through heavy fogs, and desperate sailors, thinking them either searchlights or lights from other vessels, sailed directly towards them only to strike obstructions or hidden dangers beneath the water's surface, resulting in their entire ship sinking, and usually in the deaths of everyone aboard. Also reported across George's Island are instances of personal electronics behaving erratically, extreme cold spots felt through the heat of summer, and full-on ghost ship sightings, in which various historic, long-lost vessels have been observed gliding silently through the nearby waters. Easily the most famous ghost story tied to Fort Warren involves the tragic tale of Melanie and Samuel Lanier. Now, as it goes, before he was sent off to war, Samuel Lanier, who was an attractive and promising young soldier, fell madly in love with a beautiful woman named Melanie, and she with him. And before too long, the couple was married. Through the Civil War, Sam would be called into battle under the Confederate flag, and Melanie would worry and worry and worry. Then, one day, the news she feared just under that of actual death came. Her beloved had been captured and was being held at Fort Warren. But unlike most wives of the era, she quickly decided that she wasn't going to let a silly little thing like, a highly fortified island POW camp deep behind enemy lines slow her down. No siree. So Melanie set off on a northbound journey from either Georgia or South Carolina, and arrived later at her destination being Hull, Massachusetts. Now, for those of you who aren't as polished in your geography, Hull is literally a finger of land jutting out into the Atlantic just to the southeast of Fort Warren, and back in this day and age, it was completely clear of the traffic of Boston, which was a good distance to the west of the fort. Once in Hull, Melanie met with a group of loyal Confederates. She cut her hair and wrapped her torso to hide her chest, and then she and all of her party members donned stolen Union uniforms. Under the cover of nightfall, the group would row around 2 miles out to George's Island, where Melanie would follow the sound of Sammy's whistling from high above in the fort until they found his window. Once they'd located Mr. Lanier, the prisoners would then lower a rope down, and Melanie, being just slender enough to slip through the bars, would make her way back up the rope with a pickaxe and a pistol. After an emotional reunion with her husband, the two gathered up other prisoners and started taking shifts in order to dig a hidden tunnel that would run beneath the parade grounds, with their end goal being the arsenal, where they planned to arm themselves and capture the fort from within. Unfortunately, none of these guys were excavators, miners, or anything like that, and their plan was a little green. The result? During their dig, they got just a bit too close to one of the casemates, resulting in guards storming their tunnel and in an ensuing scuffle. Now, while some say this next part involved the aforementioned Colonel Justin Dimmick, knowing what we do about the guy, I kind of have a hard time believing that. So I'll just say that either Dimmick or, more likely, another officer harbored a beef with Lanier. And as it's told, Melanie faced off against this officer in the famed tunnel fight. Sadly, when Melanie drew her pistol, it said that either a critical failure occurred in which the gun actually exploded in her hand, or that the officer she was facing managed to overpower her and take the pistol. Whatever the case, a shot was accidentally discharged, and it struck Mr. Lanier square in the chest, killing him instantly. Following this incident, Melanie was promptly sentenced to death by way of hanging for being a spy. It said that Melanie didn't say a single word following Sam's death during the trial, and that she didn't even try to fight her sentence. The only request she made came right before her hanging, when she asked for a dress or something similar so that she didn't have to die in men's clothing. It's said the fort honored this request and outfitted her with the only garment they could find on the island, a black dress complete with a veil that was either a prop piece used for theater performances on base, or mourner's attire from one of the funerals held there. Whatever the case, the day came and Melanie faced her death without so much as a whimper. But then it started. After her hanging, soldiers across fort grounds began reporting sightings of Melanie still clad in her black dress, lurking in the darkest parts of the fort, her face nearly invisible beneath her veil, and a menacing ambiance about her. At first, the fort's higher-ups thought this phenomenon either a prank or some form of collective delusion, but there was just one problem. The reports were too many and too spread out, and most of them were completely unconnected with others. Eventually, fear of the Lady in Black became so real that a handful of soldiers were actually pulled for a new duty to shoot at the Phantom in Black whenever she appeared. And as insane as it sounds, one of these specially selected soldiers actually got in trouble following a night when he claimed he shot the ghost to no avail, and was then charged by a terrifyingly angry Melanie, who scared him so badly that he literally ran from his post. To this day, many who visit the fort tell of encounters with Melanie, and while her presence has seemed to become more docile as time's gone by, there are still those terrifying instances in which witnesses have described her as seemingly filled with pure fury as she glides to and fro, cackling into the wind. Thanks for joining me on this journey through some of the most haunted places in Massachusetts. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel. Throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll see you all next time, and pleasant dreams.